ele sugere é fundamentalismo.
Eu passo, então... Sim, aqui primeiro, depois. Três.
I would want to thank you for that really rich and thought-provoking paper. There's so many things at the end that one could talk about, but I got stuck at the very first part of the paper a little bit. So when you were making the distinction between the kind of facile Marxist, economic, materialistic explanation, and counterposing that to a more religious explanation. The examples that you gave, I don't know if I remember all of them. I remember the Carolingians in them and the early spread of Islam. But it seems to me that the fundamental problem with those kind of analogies is that what's so interesting about your topic is that you're dealing with a resistance to a religion in religious innovation on both sides of a political revolution, which you can't really find in the early caliphate or in, maybe you could find it in the Merovingians or Carolingians, but there's nothing of that scale in the examples that you used. So what I want to do is query you a little bit on by acknowledging that you've got this resistance on either side of the political revolution. I want to suggest that rather than use that distinction between economic materialism and religion, that a better term might be political theology, or that the explanation is political theological. And by saying that, I'm using the words of Karl Schmidt in 1922 in Weimar, Germany, and suggesting to you that might be a better analogy, because Hitler is going to resist the introduction of new gods, especially like Anglo-American liberal gods. But if you look on the other side of the Weimar Republic to guys like Max Weber, that they are pretty relativistic, and that they're not really interested in bringing in new gods either, and that if you maybe use the Weimar example, that there's resistance to new gods, especially Western liberal gods, as it were, on either side of the Great Divide, that it might be a better way of explaining why there was a political theological resistance on both sides in Rome. And since this is what I want to ask you about, is that with using the America facile example in Weimar, what I want to ask you about is the influence of Egypt on this political theological problem in Rome. So that it seems to me that, like on the Republic side of the divide, they're not going to annex Egypt. And we've got all those battles about not sending Lentulus Spinther off to take it, and the Gabinius thing. And in other words, there's a resistance to actually annexing Egypt, which it seems to me has a theological, political power, which is, of course, when Augustus finally annexes Egypt, that's going to really help the imperial cult. So like on one side of Augustus, he doesn't want new gods because he's the new god, as it were, kind of reinforced by Egypt. And on the Egypt side, they're kind of resistant to bringing in Egypt precisely because of its theological, political, pharaonic, kind of Caesaro-papist, even though that's anachronistic to put it that way, but because of its tremendous theological, political power. And so that maybe the political revolution, do you think there's any possibility that the political revolution had what I'm calling a theological political dimension based on Egypt?
Thank you. That's a very rich question. There's a lot there. Probably I can't answer it all right now. These are, of course, modern preoccupations in Germany, where the successors of both the DDR and the GDR are worried about why Weber has not come out the way it was meant to. I think the idea of trying to bring the two together is always helpful. I'm leaving Egypt aside for a moment, when I see the part of the difficulty with Roman history is that we've come to regard culture, in which I'd include religious action and literature, as something which is fundamentally reactive. That the main story happens somewhere else, and then you see what happens to Latin epic or ritual or gastronomics as a result. And I suppose what I want to try and do and try and do myself is to keep all of those things in play all the way through. And I'll think a little bit about the Weimar example. As for Egypt, I suspect the Romans have known about Egypt for a long time. There is a huge interest in it after Augustus. Some people were interested before, but in a less legitimate way. So thanks, yes. Thank you for that question. It's not only in Brazil that is constantly quoted everywhere. I think that I would never take an individual poet as representative, because I think that most individual poets respond to a consensus rather than simply channel it. I'm very struck by the work of people like Dennis Feeney and Stephen Hines and Thomas Habeneck, who pointed out that at every period of Roman history we see people claiming to be encountering Greece for the first time, and you can't find a Rome before Greece. And Peter Wiseman's made the point in other contexts, and so when Horace says that, it seems to me to be a metapoetic claim that his verse is better than what's gone before, because he has in some way drunk more deeply of Greek inspiration. But this seems to me to be exactly what every Greek poet does. Our first Latin poetry is Plautus, who certainly drunk very deep of Greek poetry, and I think Dennis Feeney's new work on the origins of Latin literature I find very persuasive. So I wouldn't call Horace wrong. I think it's an interested metapoetic claim, and it's certainly. But Rome's been encountering Greece forever. Habeneck makes this wonderful point in his book on the beginnings of Latin literature that we've all come. We for a while we were used to saying, well, first Rome conquers, Macedonian wars and so on, and then Greek culture comes over. But if you actually look for signs of Greek literature in Rome, it's all there long before they crossed the Adriatic. And after you don't need to go very far from Rome to meet a Greek city, it's a day trip. So I mean, Horace seems to me to be making a conventional claim within the context of Roman poetics. I'm no Latinist, but that's how I would read it.
Obrigada. Nesse caso, houve algumas citações, precisa de tradução? Não? Não, então ok, acho que não. Todo mundo compreendeu. Federico, por favor.
Oh, thanks. Okay, three-part theology first. Well, like you and Augustine, I'm puzzled, so we're in good company. It's become quite fashionable now to evoke it, hasn't it? Because it coheres with a set of 1980s arguments, which you referred to actually when you said people don't worry anymore about the fact that you can be both a Roman priest and a philosopher who claims not to believe in the gods at the same time. And one of the solutions for this is the work of Paul Vane, which started in his book Les Grecs ont-ils cru à le mythe? Did the Greeks believe in their myths? And he had this idea of what he calls brain balkanization, which he means a kind of compartmentalized thinking, that in one context I think, if you ask me as a philosopher I say this, if you ask me as a priest I say something else. And that's become quite a popular solution, except in the version where you say in public, when I'm talking to the masses, I believe in the gods, but privately I don't believe in any of them, which I think comes from Spartacus. So three-part theology, in some ways it looks like it's a kind of situational thing, doesn't it? Insofar as one behaves in relation to the Sacra Publica, the official things, one does one thing. As far as you read the poets, it's another. I find this very difficult. And actually, I think that Claudia Moatti's work makes this even more difficult, because if you believe Rome's going through something like an Enlightenment, then one of the features of Enlightenment idea, as I understand it, in the European Enlightenment, is it breaks down compartmentalized thinking. That you end up trying to find, if you're trying to find a way, if you're Isaac Newton, that brings together mathematics, astrology, and theism. And you try and you have you begin to put a high value on consistent beliefs. And that seems to be a bit of a definition of an enlightenment. But how that coexists with brain balkanization, I don't know. I don't know how you can be an enlightened brain balkanist or whatever. And Dennis Feeney's promoted this idea of brain balkanization too. And so I think the three-part theology, which has been taken up by Jörg Rücker, among others, recently, I think it describes a problem without really solving it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so that's how... That's the place it's got in my story. It's not a very good place, but it's the best I can do. Imperial cults. The piece that you mentioned of mine was in a volume organised by the Oriental Institute in Chicago, and it was a cross-cultural work where people talked about Egypt and China, and a lot of people talked about Mesopotamia and the Maya, and I did Rome. And what really emerged from that is how unusual the Roman Republic is, or the Greek polis, in not having a more explicit form of ruler cult. That some forms, it's not always imagined the same way, but in most early societies, political powers are believed to, in some sense, mediate between, or be halfway towards, or partake of quality of the sacred. And the classical city-state, in Fustel de Coulanges' sense, is unusual in that kind of religious manner is distributed around the institutions, the magistracies and the Senate and all the rest of it. So Rome seems to me to be coming out of another unusual period when it goes back to worshipping its, presumably the regal period. Well, we know some things about the kings seem to connect them to the gods, and the emperors come to be connected to the gods, and so the problem really, I think, is to explain how the city-state avoids that. But that would expand, that rather like Weimar, that would expand the scope of my paper considerably.
Okay, Valentina?
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that. I'm inclined to the first of your two alternatives, not as a sort of conscious optimism, but simply that as Romans move from a plural political system where they're one of a number of competing powers to one where they really think they're different from other people completely, at that same point their view of the cosmos, or their place in the cosmos, shifts as well. And I suppose I don't think it's being done consciously. I think it's simply that as people try to create some coherence, certain beliefs seem to fit with the experience of the 60s, 70s and 50s must have been extraordinary. The rate at which new areas are being swallowed up, places are really almost literally being discovered and conquered at the same time. And if we think about areas north of the Alps in particular. And so I'd see it working more like that, and I suppose that would go with the one of the ways in which Mary Beard, among others, argued about the importation of new gods is that there's a kind of nervousness about dealing with the gods of other peoples. When do you want to? Evocatio seems to be getting them on your side because you wouldn't really want to occupy an alien god. But I'm not sure that But I wonder whether your two alternatives are mutually completely exclude each other, because one could imagine one might have different kinds of fear at different points in one's imperial journey. The fear of ending up surrounded by hostile gods is one kind of fear, and the sort of other fears go with world conquest. So, yeah, I think. Thank you.
Juliana?
Just a couple of comments you were talking about this. That I was thinking maybe is it kind of as if they could look at each other and say, see how the gods are favoring us. We must be doing everything right to see.
Which they say
Yeah,
this
it's
explicitly.
one of the favorites, so
But doesn't that also carry a terrible fear? I mean, it's like
They don't, yes.
okay, yeah.
it depends on how
And
much
what
you
if
show
they
it.
don't?
If you read Freud, you're familiar with the idea that if you really love someone, you fear them, because
They are the
but
ones with the
because
power to
they're-
hurt you. Yes.
precisely yes,
Yes.
exactly, and that
They are the ones with the power to hurt you.
So it means not that
Yes.
so
not just that I do everything right with them, but that I must do keep
Yes.
doing everything right with them.
and how terrifying to be riding the tiger of divine favour to conquer the world.
Am I pious enough? I have to tell
Yeah.
people that I'm pious enough, of course, but am I pious enough?
Yeah, and then particularly when you begin to hit the Civil War, I mean, presumably all this money that Augustus spends on traditional cults and temples and so on, yeah, that must respond to some kind of anxiety, mustn't it? Everything was going so well, and suddenly the whole thing's falling apart. Yeah, we're driving the car too fast; it's shaking to bits. So I see those fitting quite nicely, actually.
And this other thing I was thinking about.
I feel if someone put a gun to my head and said, "Right, which is it, Greg? Is it rationalisation in Rome, or is it brain balkanisation?" I'd say, "Well, I'll go with brain balkanisation." But it's untestable as a hypothesis. And people are very often, I mean, it's different versions of this occur with things like the jump to art and religion at the upper lower Paleolithic. There's another version of brain balkanisation there. You can't test whether or not thinking is compartmentalised. And we know that in certain contexts, contradictory beliefs cause cognitive dissonance and are powerful forces for change or dysfunction. And yet, in this context, Vane's offering it to us as a way of stabilising things. You know, look at all these inconsistent things people can believe at the same time, but it doesn't matter. Or then you've got the Verschnell version of inconsistency as what holds Roman religion together, which sounds great, but you think, well, you know.
Yeah, so this another way calms me down a little bit.
Okay. Greg, thank you very, very much indeed. And So, thank you very much. And it's time to finish. And eu peço que Federico venha à mesa, por favor. Obrigada, Greg. Para um pequeno encerramento. E Jorvan. Já para cima.
Yes, the emphasis being on pequeño. I don't have I don't have much to say, but what I'm going to say is very much.
Your computador. Your computer. Your laptop? No.
We
No.
need my laptop.
No.
It's not connected. No, I'm leaving it there. It's fine.
Não tem rede.
I would just like to say a very much heartfelt word of thanks to a number of institutions and people. Again, the British Academy, of course, for funding the Images of the Gods project, which is now coming close to the end of its first year. 2 more years to look forward to. Unirio and EMERJ for hosting in different capacities this colloquium. We are very grateful to EMERJ for its hospitality. And then, of course, well, I really like to
Thank you,
thank
Federico.
very warmly Claudia for putting
Temos-
this show together. Jorvan for the work that he's going to tell you about in a moment on the project website, and indeed all the participants in this conference from home and abroad, whatever meanings the words home and abroad might have. I'm just going to say one more thing also on Claudia's behalf, and it's about the follow-up side of this part of the project, of this conference. We are of course thinking about putting together an edited volume based on the proceedings of this conference. We are not going to set a draconian deadline. We do want to think about the shape of the volume. We want to think further about the connections between the papers. It would be invaluable, though, if Claudia and I could have fairly soon brief abstracts of the papers, Something, you know, in the region of 200, 300 words would be absolutely fine for our purposes, as well as a rough indication of the length of the contribution that you intend to make to the collection. The latter bit of information would, of course, be really quite important to getting a sense of how long the resulting book might be.